So we are here on another lovely Technique Tuesday, and we are going to be talking today about preparing your quilt backing for the long arm. The light is weird. Yeah, that's what happens in here this time of day. So what I have not loaded but prepared to load is a backing that kind of illustrates everything we don't want to have happen with our backings. And it's just like our quilt tops. We have kind of a, okay, we can work with it. Yeah, this one is better. And then the best possible results will come from working with this type of backing. So what we've got here is, yeah, I can quilt this, but the results may not be quite what we would want to see. So as you can see, it's a piece of fabric. It's been sewn together, but it's not really well pressed. So these are fairly soft creases. They'll probably stretch out in the long arming, but it would always be nicer to start with something well pressed. The one thing this backing does have going for it is that it is big enough for the quilt that we're going to be using it for. And I always double check. My quilt is 65 inches. My backing this way is 79. So that's wonderful. That's great sideways. For us here, we like to have the backings 6 inches, about that much bigger than the quilt top on all 4 sides. So that's a total of 12 inches. And that lets us load it well on the machine. We don't have to worry when we get down to the bottom that we're that close to anything. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this with this seam. This is how I often get backings dropped off. They're sewn together, but the salvages are still on and they're kind of not pressed. Now, it's better as we move into from the I can quilt it to the better if this seam runs horizontal to the machine. And I'm going to show you why, all these rules. So we're going to start. And we use a system here called leader grips. So I'm going to lay that bottom of that backing on the roller, and there's a bar inside my leader. I'm just going to put my grip on. This lets us load a quilt in like 5 minutes instead of 20 minutes. Open that seam. We'll do the best we can. There's one. Move them across here. So this is why, I don't know if I can see that, that's why we like our backing longer. I've got a couple of inches there, and I don't want to quilt right up against that grip. Now I'm going to start rolling. Roll this up and smooth it out. That. And we can already see what's starting to happen here. The salvages and the sewing, and the fact that we have twice as much fabric in that center, is starting to create a bit of a lump. Yeah, I don't know, that's not going on very straight. Well, it doesn't look too bad as yet. Our goal is to get the backing on as flat and as smooth as we can. Now you can see what's happening here. I'm getting some looseness in there because this seam is really tight compared to our fabric. Now, as I say, We could quilt it, but it's not laying really, really flat. So, that was yeah, we can quilt this. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing. Line this up. I think some of these people may have heard this all before, but it's worth repeating. So you can already see that even though this backing hasn't been pressed, it's going on a lot straighter this way around. Even with the selvages on that seam. This is what I teach people. Is everybody there? Teach people in certification when it comes to loading backings. We want it square-ish. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm paying attention. Not to the squareness, but to how the fabric is draping.
Is that what you don't like to see as backing?
As far as types of fabric, I don't think so. I wouldn't want to go and see something like a denim, or anything with big lumps in it. That's why we try to get the seam horizontally. But, and again, stretchy fabrics, knits and that sort of thing just take a little more finesse when it comes to loading them. But really, we can work with just about any kind of fabric as long as it's big enough.
Yeah. So what do you do if after you put the backing there isn't enough fabric?
Well, as long as your backing fabric is a little bit bigger than your quilt top, you can sew an extra piece of fabric, about 6 inches wide, especially to the top and the bottom of your backing. It won't be quilted into your quilt, but that lets us line your quilt top up right with that seam and use as much of that backing fabric as possible. If you have to sew your fabric together and the only way your quilt's going to fit on it means that it runs vertically up and down your quilt, sometimes what we can do is take the whole quilt and turn it sideways. So the top of the quilt is here, the bottom is there, the seam is still running this way to the machine, and as long as you're not choosing a quilting design that has to be a particular direction on the quilt, that will work perfectly fine. If we do not want batting, it's still possible to quilt. The only thing I would be careful of with that is the polyesters like the Minky and the Cuddle, because the inside of those is very slippery. And I've actually tried it with no batting in there, and the top just slides around. So even with the computer, the design is distorted too much. If you don't want batting, you can even, if you still are working with like a cuddle fabric, you can actually use a layer of flannel. Just as a little bit of support. There we go. So now, that's loaded. It's all nice and flat, nice and square. And now the next step would be to lay out the backing and the quilt top, right up about there. So there's a good 3.5 to 4 inches of fabric there. And that's why we need that little bit of extra. Yeah, there's not too much we can't quilt on these machines. It's more a case of trying to get the best possible results for you. We can obviously quilt. I've done quilts with polar fleece for backing. I've done mattress tops for a local mattress company, and that was done with hemp, a woven hemp fabric. So it's just a matter of the best possible results. Now, when I started here, they said, you can't use sheets for quilt backings. And I thought about it and I thought, yeah, well, why not? It's just a big piece of fabric. If you want to use a sheet for your backing, obviously you don't have to worry about seams, but what you will want to do is either trim off or unstitch and wash and press all the hems around the quilt, because that's going to give the same problem that vertical seam gives. It's going to tension differently than the fabric. The other thing to be aware of is if you're going to use a sheet, a lot of times the thread count on our sheets is higher than our standard cotton fabric. So again, that resulting quilt might be physically just a little bit heavier than if you used a standard fabric. So we've talked about yeah, we can quilt it, but we've talked definitely about better. This is going to give you really, really good results. Best is if I had given this a real good press and trimmed the selvages off of that seam that I have on there. Another best result comes from buying our extra wide backings. And they are 108 inches wide. They're top quality quilting fabric. Very often they are matches to some of the fabric lines that we have. Yeah, grab that one, Tyler. That's really pretty. Can you imagine having that on the back of your quilt? And at 108 inches wide, you don't have to worry about sewing it together unless you're doing a humongous quilt, and some people do. Isn't that gorgeous? But that's going to give you some of the best results is the extra wide backing fabric. Wouldn't that be fun? You can always use the fabric in the quilt cloth for the next quilt. So at 108 inches, there's not too many quilts, those won't fit, and then you don't have to worry about sewing it together or anything like that. Our cuddle and our fireside, I think our fireside is 60 inches wide. So the same thing applies to that. If your quilt is bigger and you want to sew it together, get that seam running horizontally. They're both napped fabrics, so if you're going to sew it together, make sure you cut two pieces and rotate one so you have the fuzz all going in the same direction. And that's basically it when it comes to backings. Sometimes we get people asking, what about a pieced backing? And they're great, actually. It's a great way to use up the extra blocks from your quilt. It's a great way to use up just the scrap pieces. Similar sort of thing applies if you're going to sew a row of blocks together. Maybe it would be nice if they went across your quilt instead of up and down. But strangely enough, a completely pieced backing will give less problems than a single vertical seam. And I think it's because all of those seams they even out the tensioning. So don't be afraid to make a backing for your quilt of 10-inch blocks and sew them all together. It's almost like having a reversible quilt. As long as you make sure that backing is still bigger than your quilt top all the way around. If you have a piece backing or you have something special on the back of your quilt, make sure you point that out when you bring it in for long arming. So you've got this lovely chevron panel, and you want it set not right in the center, but off to one side. So explain that to us, and we can load your quilt to make sure that that piece fits exactly where you want it, or fairly close. I can't say exact when it comes to long armings because we're working with fabric and it moves and it shifts. So, but we'll get it pretty close. The wide backing is the same fiber content as, well, the Cuddle and the Minky are polyester, 100%. Our other wide backings are 100% cotton. So I would say if you do not wash your quilt top, then you don't have to worry about washing your backing. If you do like to pre-wash your fabrics before you build your quilt, then I would pre-wash the backing. This fabric that I just loaded is for one of my quilts, and it's been pre-washed. That's why it's so wrinkly. So it kind of evens out that shrinkage, and you don't have to worry about it, something like that. And that's basically it. It's not nearly as complicated as the quilt top, but it is in some ways equally important to get that backing right. Well, that's about all we've got for today. I think a little bit down the road we might talk about batting. It's a little bit tricky because right now our batting supply, we're having difficulty accessing certain things, but your batting can make a difference in the finished result of your quilt. And that is not a good, better, best situation. That's a how do you want it to feel situation. So until then, stay safe, stay calm, stay kind. Bye.